Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us right now from Orlando, Florida is John L. Casey. He's the president of the Space and Science Research Center and a former White House Space Program advisor and NASA consultant. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right, so much of the U.S. is still digging out of or thawing out from this so-called polar vortex, but according to a recent op-ed that you wrote, which appeared in the Orlando Sentinel, people might want to get used to this kind of weather.
Absolutely. I think the research we've published and is well recognized by others around the world shows that we're heading into a long, cold climate era, so we should get prepared for this kind of thing.
Well, as simply as you can, explain these sun cycles and what is so important, particularly about 2014.
If one looks at solar cycles as indicators of climate change, you'll find several things. Number one, they're extremely reliable when it comes to predicting climate variation. This compares with the greenhouse gas theory that we've heard so much about from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for 20 years now. Unfortunately, their models are very poorly reflected in the data. They simply don't work. And what we've realized now is that the mankind's CO2 production has really very small impact, if any, on climate change. It's really the sun that causes climate change, and that's what we're working toward, is predicting the next climate change based on solar models. And these show us clearly that we're heading into decades of cold climate. Our Russian colleagues have picked out 2014 as the year when, in fact, they say a little ice age will begin. We don't think it's going to be quite that severe as yet, but certainly cold enough to give us concern for the next 2 decades.
And explain for us what that looks like. I mean, even if we're not going to use the term "little ice age," what does a significant cooling event look like for food production? What does it look like for the way that we travel? What does it look like, for humankind as a whole?
If one looks at the history, and we're working off a 206-year solar cycle that is simply repeating as it often does, if we go back to the last time we had this cool era, which we call a solar hibernation, that was from 1793 to 1830 roughly. And during that period, the cold was so severe and crop damage globally so bad that many people starved and froze to death. Historian John D. Post called it the humankind's worst subsistence crisis ever recorded.
And compared to the way that temperatures are tracked now, what kind of technology was being used back then, other than written accounts about the temperatures and things of that nature?
Well, of course, the temperature thermometer that we're also used to now didn't really come into play as a formal measurement instrument in the U.S. until 1850. Before that, it was used in Europe, and there are other methods of determining what temperatures we had. The oldest measured record is in central England, but of course they're kind of affected by the Gulf Stream, so they're not truly representative of the world's temperature trend. We have to go to other kinds of means of extracting temperature to go back any further.
And how do you do that?
Well, we do that by measuring the isotopes of various atoms, beryllium, oxygen, carbon. We go back and through ice cores and deep sea and deep lake cores, extract gases and those isotopes, measure their relative quantities, and from those we can determine what temperatures existed during those periods.
And so in other words, there's some rigorous scientific study going on here. And this kind of all goes back about 7 years when you were an advisor to the White House and you first brought forth your findings on this global cooling phenomenon. You say that you faced some attacks. You were ridiculed and even slandered. What was that like for you?
Well, first off, I knew that was coming. If one looks at the history of science, anytime someone stands up to the dogma of the day, they get attacked, whether it be in a science field or a political field or a medical field, doesn't matter. If you're a lone wolf and saying something that's basically opposite of what the rest of the community is saying, you're going to be attacked. So I knew that was coming. And when I announced to the White House, the mainstream media, and government agencies and the scientific community my predictions for climate, that was even more so an opportunity to attack me. Regardless of my space program credentials, I had none in climatology, so I was kind of the new kid on the block and open for attack.
And you said you expected that because there are so many people who are on the other side of this argument that are just so absolutely certain that you are wrong. And folks who question man-made global warming, these folks just have it made up in their minds 100% that y'all are wrong. What do you think is going to change those people's minds?
Well, it's going to be difficult for them. I know it was very difficult for me back in March and April of 2007 when I completed my solar physics research, determined a particular 206-year cycle of the sun that was ending global warming and now was going to start global cooling. It was difficult, so I expect it will be difficult for many people. Realistically, we've had 23, 25 years of propaganda about mankind causing climate change because of greenhouse gases. So if that's all one hears for 20, 25 years, you would expect people to pretty much accept that approach. So until things really change, it's going to be difficult.
Let's take a look at that chart here from the taxpayer-backed climate scientists over at NOAA. It goes all the way back to 1950, and it takes a look at the average Earth temperatures. And if you look at this just on its own, you think, oh wow, look, temperatures are increasing pretty rapidly here, especially over the last couple decades. But if you take this into account and combine it with your research, should we expect to see that trend line coming back down? In other words, maybe like a bell-shaped curve here, say 50 years from now?
Actually, we'll see that curve downtrend already existent in the data. It will only accelerate as the new cold climate begins. And let me explain that chart you're talking about. I've seen that chart from 1850 to present. That chart is comparable to the old phrase, can't see the forest for the trees. It's a very small time window in terms of climate temperature variation analysis. You really need to go back at least 200 years in temperature chartsmanship and temperature data to see what's really happening with climate change, especially on the 206-year cycle. They're looking at a temperature range of about 60 years. That's only 1/3 of the 206-year cycle, so they really can't see what's coming because they're only looking at a very small spectrum of temperature.
Now, of course, also we hear this a lot, and a lot of people in the media go straight to NOAA statistics that point out that the hottest years on record since they started keeping track have occurred between 2012 and 1998. That's reflected in that graph. But so what you're saying here, John, is that NOAA's cherry-picking data to falsely make this point.
Well, what they've done in this case is definitely cherry-picking data to skew it to fit the political regime that exists both in Washington and at the UN right now. Those regimes basically say that we need to live our lives in the future based on dramatically increased temperatures, dramatically increased sea levels based on the last 20 years of temperature. Well, you can't do that, again, forest for the trees, but if you look at those temperatures, you'll find out that they were warm exactly when they should have been warm. Our solar physics models for climate change show that that was when we should have had those warmest years. But what those charts don't show, and what the NOAA folks at NOAA don't tell you, is that all of that has stopped. We've now had 10 years of cooling oceans and 7 years of cooling atmosphere, but you won't see that coming out of NOAA.
And you talk about that in the op-ed. Let's also focus on something else you wrote in the op-ed, and I'm quoting here, the latest December 10, 2013 edition of your research shows that 24 climate parameters, out of the 24 climate parameters, I should say, 18 show global cooling as the downward trend, which you just referenced. All may soon show a cooling trend, so all those parameters. Tell us a little bit more about what these parameters are and why they seem to differ, at least on a surface basis, from the ones us taxpayers are funding.
Well, again, it's a difference in philosophy. We drive our charts and our data based on facts. We are using the same data sets that NOAA has, that the UN has. We use the same satellite data, the same ground temperature data, the same sea level data. The big difference between our charts that we publish in our Global Climate Status Report every 3 months and the NOAA data that they publish on their website is that they ignore the climate parameters that are driven by the sun. They only talk about past trends and try to extrapolate from those same warming trends to the future. But you can't do that if you don't recognize that temperature has now changed. We've had 16 years without any effective growth in global temperature, but NOAA and the UN especially tends to sidestep that overwhelming 800-pound gorilla in the room. They ignore the fact that we've had the reduction in ocean and atmospheric temperature for quite some time now. And again, that's somewhat philosophy, somewhat politics. Our work and our charts and our global climate report are based on what the data is telling us, not what the politics tell us we should say.
Well, that's an excellent reminder of when you're looking at any kind of information to consider the source of where it comes from, and more importantly, what is providing the funding for that source. John L. Casey, thanks for the insight. Of course, this is one of the topics that doesn't seem to be going away. We can expect more debate and discussion on it in the future, and we hope to have you back. A pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.